Hi, this is Paul. I'm obviously on the road, but I thought I'd make a few videos. So when I travel, it's usually some mixture of vacation and work, and I try to basically maximize both. And so I am on the road. And one of the things that I do when I travel is I try to get in some reading. This is Origins magazine, and it's put out by Heritage Hall, which is a historical group at Calvin University, and Heritage Hall and Heminga Hall, not Heminga Hall, that has the classrooms, but the Meter Center, they have all sorts of documents, and they collect documents, especially with respect to Dutch North American history. And they put out this magazine quarterly, I believe. It's called Origins. It's quite inexpensive. I believe you used to be able to get a lifetime membership, and I get this from my mother. After she does them, she gives them to me. My father read it very faithfully, and so when I was in Massachusetts, she gave me the latest copy that came, and this was on Albertus Van Raalte. Now, most of you probably don't know his name. If you're from Western Michigan, you might see a statue of him in Holland, Michigan. He is often credited for bringing Dutch immigrants to Western Michigan, and this recent version of Origins came out. Now, there's a lot about this that is important for understanding CRC church history. There's an online version of this as well, and there's a free article that's online about Van Raalte from this magazine. Let me see if I can just click on it. Yeah, this is the cover, and there he is. And this article also has some really lovely letters to him. I'm not gonna focus on that. I'm gonna probably focus more. Well, I will talk about that letter because I posted a little bit of that letter on Twitter, and people seem to enjoy it. I'm going to talk a little bit about Van Raalte. So there's a terrific article by Robert Swearinga. Robert Swearinga writes he's one of the best historians on the history of the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church of America. And he's just recently written a biography of Van Raalte, which I'm sort of excited about. I buy too many books. I might buy it myself because he's a pretty important man and lives at a pretty important period of time. Albertus Van Raalte was called to preach the gospel and walk in the steps of his father, Albert, or Albertus. For 40 years he did just that on 2 continents, Europe and North America. His life unfolded in tumultuous times bracketed by Napoleon's conquest of the Netherlands and the American Civil War. In the 1920s, religious strife upset the I can't speak Dutch, the state church. We'll let Job put the Dutch in. The state church of the Netherlands, due to the European, there was a revival movement that happened in Europe towards the beginning of the 19th century, and it's actually sort of important for the history of the I think of Christianity. There's a small Wikipedia article on it. It's not a terrific article, but it'll give you some of the Réveil, or French for revival or awakening, in 1814 was a revival movement within the Swiss Reformed Church of Western Switzerland and some Reformed communities in southeastern France. The supporters were also pejoratively named, I can't say that in French either. The movement was initially promoted by small Moravian communities implanted by earlier Moravian missionary efforts and much helped by British Presbyterians. Now there was very much a Dutch version of this whose roots are important for the Christian Reformed Church. And this is sort of where Van Raalte comes into the mix. So he's part of the Réveil and the unruly offspring, the offscheiding, or the secession of 1834, which is really key to understanding the history of the Christian Reformed Church before immigration, of Hendrik de Kock, a preacher from Groningen. The authoritarian King Willem I, 1815 to 1840, tolerated reform but not secession. He subjected such pastors to harassment by police, soldiers, crippling fines, and even imprisonment. As a preacher's kid, young Albertus was often uprooted, which may have created a certain restlessness in him, but dealing with different dialects and cultures made him adaptable and flexible. His religious conversion as a young adult, after narrowly surviving cholera, led to his call to the ministry. At Leiden University, he fell in with a student reform group whose graduates entered state church pulpits, only to be expelled by joining de Kock's movement. Now, one of the things going on currently in the Christian Reformed Church, which I find very interesting and rather ironic, is that in some ways the Abide group is sort of like this group. There's a history of young pastors, not necessarily being reformers, but in this case, the reformers are conservative, and they're winning, at least in the Christian Reformed Church right now. And some people might see echoes of some of the old state church secessionist impulses between these groups. To go back to this movement, historians of, I can't say the French, I'm just going to call it Reveal, recognize that the movement had a deep influence on Protestantism in France and Switzerland. It has, for instance, been noted that French Protestant clergy more than doubled in number, 305 in 1829 to 765 in 1843, although there were also divisions and disputes. Reveal modernized Protestantism in many ways. It created new institutions such as singing of new hymns instead of just using psalms, Sunday schools, Bible study classes, or meetings, prayer meetings, etc. This is part of what's interesting about these movements, because we sort of want to use sort of conservative or progressive or conservative or liberal labels on them, and they don't really fit. This has more to do with sort of these revivals and awakenings that come up that bring new forms and new ways of doing ministry, even while at heart they're conservative movements. I noticed that the Jesus Revolution movie is now on Netflix. I haven't watched it yet because, again, I've been traveling, but I very much want to take a look at that, because part of what was interesting about the Jesus People movement was that it was both conservative, it was sort of, I don't like the word, it was literalistic in terms of its use of scripture. It tended to be Pentecostal, it tended to be pietistic, it tended to be emotional, while at the same time it did bring innovation to the church and to Christianity. And in terms of the Jesus movement, it brought new instruments. So you have the drums and the guitar, and you have folk music coming up to become sort of this main American expression of, and really Western, because of course Hillsong in Australia really grabbed onto, but all this whole new musical revival, sort of all within a conservatism. And you see that right now to a degree with Abide in the Christian Reformed Church, and they're sort of, even though these movements are kind of anti-revolutionary, they are revolutionary in their own way. And so there's all these interesting dynamics in many of these movements as they continue to move and evolve in the church. So on one hand, they're sort of a restorationist movement. They want to get back to the early church, or at least a vision of the early church. You saw this even in the Seeker movement, which in many ways followed the Jesus People movement, and the revolution in contemporary worship, while at the same time being sort of a conservative movement, wanting to get back to biblical Christianity in terms of, let's say, the Abide group wanting to get back to sort of a perspective on reformational Christianity, Reformed in terms of understanding Reformed in a particular way. So it's interesting how young people sort of grab onto these movements, and they at one hand they bring innovation even while in other aspects they're conservative. And again, we've seen that with the Abide group, where they've been much more adept at using social media and using modern tools, while at the same time wanting to go back to hymn singing. What's ironic there is that in some ways hymn singing is different from, let's say, the Genevan Psalms. And in that way, trying to follow things with sort of tags like conservatism doesn't really work, because they're also bringing innovation as they go. And this movement, it's ironic that an anti-revolutionary movement is itself in some ways revolutionary, because they're pushing against the powers that be. In the case of the Christian Reformed Church now, let's say the CRC establishment. In the case of Van Raalte, let's say the state church. And you see these movements go on and on. So on one hand, again, they're bringing change, they're bringing innovation, often with respect to technology, musical technology, now communication technology, while at the same time in the service of sort of a conservatism, or a view of a certain kind of conservatism. Van Raalte was the youngest club member, completing, I gotta go. Okay. Van Raalte was the youngest club member, completed his theological studies. Church officials refused to ordain him. The new Christian seceded church happily installed him as a circuit-riding apostle of Overijssel in his home province. In every barn church gathering, he was hounded by the police and soldiers for conducting illegal, unauthorized worship services. Nevertheless, he planted new congregations throughout the east-central region of the Netherlands, logging 20,000 miles in his first decade, 1836 to 1846. Van Raalte was always on the go, leaving his wife for weeks at a time, which earned him a reputation as a traveling man. This changed when he settled into a pulpit at Omen and began training men for ministry. Then he cut back on traveling, except to attend church assemblies and put out fires among the separatist colleagues. Now part of this spirit generally is a purity spirit, or a purifying spirit, which, while sort of being able to have a common front against, let's say, the establishment, which in the case of Van Raalte was the Dutch state church, in the case of the Christian Reformed Church now sort of the CRC establishment. But once they lose that reactive, that great reactive hegemony to push against, they tend to fragment. Again, you see this sort of fractally in American culture, while even sort of the cultural dominant establishment might like to put on radical airs, as Jonathan Peugeot often mentions. They're really parasitic. You need to keep the patriarchy around so you can keep the revolution against the patriarchy around. You need to keep certain forms of racism around so you can keep your anti-racism around. And in that sense, again, sometimes these movements are sort of parasitic. In 1846, Van Raalte sought a larger stage by leading a group of separatists to America, crossing the Atlantic then, and once again in 1866 to attend a church synod. He added 16,000 nautical miles to his log. In America, he traveled another 16,000 miles in church work and fundraising. He had his application for missionary support appointment among the Zulus in South Africa borne fruit. He would have added another 20,000 miles. In his 20 years as a pastor, he was absent from his pulpit more than 10% of the time. His extensive travels gave him a vast knowledge of the United States, from the mid-Atlantic coast to the frontier of Kansas. This also made him a household name in Dutch Reformed circles on 2 continents, and earned him an honorary doctorates from New York University and Queens College, later Rutgers University. Van Raalte was the first Dutch dominee, that's Lord in Latin, to establish a colony in the Midwest frontier, and his Michigan settlements in time became the largest Dutch community in North America. His charismatic personality commanded attention and attracted followers. He was a natural leader in church and state, an American Moses in the eyes of his supporters, a pope in the eyes of his critics. He combined the roles of religious and economic leader in a unique and powerful way. As the only university graduate in the colony and head of the flagship congregation, he truly was the dominant dominie in the church and community. To help his colony thrive, Van Raalte pinched pulpit preparations to plant churches and schools, invested in lands and businesses, developed infrastructure, fostered local government, and provided political and civic leadership. His time-consuming land dealings funded a lifestyle above the norm. He died a millionaire in today's dollars. He put more on his plate than he could handle and burned out before his time. Only a dauntless person could have accomplished what he did in the face of constant criticism and controversies. Turning points. Van Raalte experienced a number of turning points in his life. Because his father was on the king's payroll as a pastor in the state church, he could send his promising youngest son to Leiden University, his alma mater. Albertus lacked purpose, however, until the Belgian Revolt in 1830 and the cholera epidemic of 1832 matured him. Students, including seminarians, were inducted into the army and thrown into the so-called 10 Days Campaign, where they were shocked to see fellow students fall in battle. Albertus trained for war, but the brief campaign ended before he completed boot camp. He returned to campus sobered and serious. "Spare my life so I can preach," he prayed, and he entered the theological department. On campus, Albertus fell in with a half-dozen reform-minded seminarians, all military veterans led by the bold and able Hendrik Scholte. Upperclassmen Simon van Velzen and Anthony Brommelkamp introduced him to Scholte and his club. This coterie was tight with Reveal men in Leiden and Amsterdam, notably Willem Bilderdijk, who since the 1820s had been calling for reform in the state church. But these reformers never broke with the church, choosing to reform it from within. The seminarians preferred to sit under private teachers, notably Leiden textile merchant Johannes Lefevre and Lucas Engeling, pastor of Leiden's Pieterskirk, whose teaching drew Van Raalte into the reform movement and its critique of theological drift of the state church. Now, he would not be able to get into the state church, which disappointed him because his father was in the state church, so he didn't want to be a rebel. And what's interesting is that when he comes to America, he helps establish the RCA, which is sort of the sister of the state church, and then the Christian Reformed Church will break out of it, mostly from the kind of people that he was with before, but now he was sort of the establishment and others were responding to him. And in that way, the Christian Reformed Church grew larger than the Reformed Church of America through all of the immigration. It's just such an interesting article. In the Michigan Schism of 1857, this was the one that birthed what would become the Christian Reformed Church, my denomination, Van Raalte faced a schism of his own congregation. This time he was on the side of church authorities, testifying to the RCA's orthodoxy and working to uphold its authority. As he was the leader of Classis Holland, seceders now directed criticism at him. In a sense, he became the Dutch-American Donker Curtius. You'll have to look him up. I did. It still didn't really help me understand the quote that well. Joining the RCA in 1850 stymied Van Raalte's passion and plans for Christian day schools. Now, Christian day schools would be a hallmark of the Christian Reformed Church. The RCA would tend to look at tell its people to join American public schools as sort of a missionary effort. Apart from classical academies such as Holland Academy for pre-seminary students, the RCA endorsed public schools. Van Raalte carried to the grave his disappointment when the parochial day school he established at First Church failed after 5 years. His Holland Academy did continue for 50 years as Hope Preparatory School, the teacher training school of Hope College, until 1838. By then, immigrants in the Christian Reformed Church had carried out Van Raalte's fervent prayers for primary education by founding Holland Christian Schools in 1901. Now, this is the advent of Hope College, which is in Holland, Michigan, and Calvin University. I guess it's Hope University now, and Calvin University in Grand Rapids, and sort of the rivalry between them. So in many ways, Van Raalte's vision gets carried out in the Christian Reformed Church, even though Van Raalte stays in the RCA. Van Raalte absorbed the evangelical and pietistic overtones of Reveal and his tension between belief and practice. His sermons emphasized biblical teaching, and his application urged pious living. To some strict Calvinists, the gospel he preached set works over grace, piety over promise. Gordon Spikeman, a student of his sermons, concluded that Van Raalte preached the gospel in parts, intellect over emotions and will, rather than the whole man. His expository sermons minimized Reformed doctrine, but he faithfully preached the Heidelberg Catechism in the afternoon service and diligently taught the shorter compendium to youngsters. Although Van Raalte aspired to Groen van Prinster's vision of Christian day schools, he did not adopt his wider Reformed world and life view, which came to full expression under Abraham Kuyper, later in the century. Van Raalte left the Netherlands long before Kuyper's day. The American dominie was a product of the mid-19th century. He preached Christ as personal Savior and Lord and admonished the faithful to remain unspotted from the world, but he never claimed the culture for Christ. Now, what's so interesting, too, in these nuances as they sort of ping-pong back and forth in the Dutch Calvinist tradition in America, the RCA would become, of course, the home congregation for the likes of, let's say, Robert Schuller in California, who would pick up from some of the Jesus Revolution, some of the adaptability. That would then be seen eventually as sort of liberalism or watering down, and it would also be critiqued as pietistic, and this is like soul salvationism. The Christian Reformed Church kind of follows Kuyper, especially in the post-World War II Canadian emigration. And so these issues now sort of bounce back and forth in the current culture war of the Christian Reformed Church. Some might see, let's say, the Abide group and some of our new young pastor leaders as a little bit more pietistic, conservative in their own way. But again, this conservative liberal label really doesn't hold. Whereas you will hear a lot of the Kuyperian world and life, world transformation, cultural transformation themes come out of the establishment in the Christian Reformed Church, out of Calvin University, and really many of the establishment people. But they're now sort of aligned sort of with the affirming camp, which is kind of ironic because in a way, the cultural transformation then, it's just interesting how these issues ping pong back and forth and don't, again, can't sort of neatly be resolved as sort of liberal and conservative. His purview was limited to personal behavior. He did not join the post-millennial crusades so common in Reformed circles of his day. Abolition, prohibition, Sabbatarian laws, or prison reform. But he did late in his ministry attend anti-Masonic and ecumenical crusades, notably Evangelical Alliance. One of the things that I noted when I was working with the RCA about 15 years ago in some projects that the CRC and the RCA were doing together, where you would find very evangelical RCA congregations and pastors. Many of them would be conservative on social issues. Many of them are now leaving the RCA, joining the Alliance or Reformed Churches, or maybe some other conservative American Presbyterian church split-offs like the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. So again, you see these issues go back and forth, and then you had these other issues like the Sabbatarianism, which became sort of a big thing in the Christian Reformed Church up until the 1980s, and so now we're seeing again, you sort of have this grab bag of issues, and as time goes by, these issues get sort of pulled one way or another. Well, it's interesting, too, that this I'll just read the conclusion here. It's quite good. Van Raalte had a domineering personality with an aristocratic demeanor and authoritarian actions. He did not take kindly to critics, dissenters, and rivals, which is ironic because he, of course, became a secessionist of sorts, even though he didn't want to be one. Yet he accomplished more in his life than most men of his time as a preacher, immigrant leader, community builder, and social entrepreneur. He was the undisputed leader of all Reformed Hollanders in the Midwest. His sermons and counseling captivated parishioners. His colony became the engine for the making of West Michigan, the Dutch center of North America, and his real estate dealings made him a millionaire in today's dollars. Most remarkably, Van Raalte would have eschewed accolades. In his mind, he faced more failures than successes. His path to the ministry in his father's church had been blocked unjustly by church authorities when he refused to concede even minor points of church rules and regulations. He experienced bitter church schisms on both continents. He made the historical church name the Gereformeerde I can't say this. I've got an American throat, as my old Dutch neighbors would have said in Patterson. He made the church name, the Re-Reformed Church, a hill to die on. Polity, not doctrine, was his red line. Van Raalte was unfairly castigated for selling the town lots platted in Holland, a responsibility he had accepted only at the urging of the People's Assembly. He conducted the task openly and honestly. His business ventures in Oman, clothed as job programs for harried separatists, stumbled, as did his silent partnership in primary industries in Holland, namely a potash factory, a tannery, a lumber and flour mill. In partnership with Paulist and Blijker, the Kalamazoo Dutch capitalist, ended with Van Raalte's personal bankruptcy in 1852. At the same time, he lost a press war with the local newspaper editor, Hermanus Doogsburg. He learned to his chagrin that editors have a bigger bully pulpit than do preachers. Also at the time, his consistory chastised him for neglecting the pulpit and spending insufficient time in his study. These years were a low point in his life, but disappointment continued. In the 1860 and 1864 presidential elections, when survival of the Union was at stake, voters twice spurned his expressed wishes to vote for Abraham Lincoln. In 1866, in other words, he wanted his people to vote for Lincoln, and apparently the Dutch wanted to vote for the other guy. In 1866, he was emotionally drained in serving Holland's mother church and returned for 6 months to the Netherlands. In his return, he refused to attend consistory meetings for a year until the brethren birthed new congregations and accepted his resignation. Then upstart city leaders, against his strongly stated wishes, had the state legislature incorporate the city of Holland in 1867. As a compromise, he left his homestead outside the city limits. He is no longer a voting resident in the city that he birthed and nourished. In 1869, Van Raalte left Holland to establish the Amelia colony in Virginia, which failed dismally, and he returned with his reputation severely damaged. He should have turned his eyes north or west rather than south. Tragedies then drained him emotionally and sapped his strength. First was the disappearance of his first son and namesake, Albertus, who at age 32 deserted his pregnant wife and 4 young children, never to be seen or heard from again. Wow. The not knowing made this a more grievous blow than the expected death from tuberculosis of Peter Ogle, his son-in-law and associate in ministry. Ogle was a kindred spirit who walked in Van Raalte's footsteps, a path of his 3 sons left untrod. Ogle served his first charge in Amelia and his second in Pella's First Reformed Church. The pulpit Van Raalte had declined. Ogle finished as a theological professor at Hope College, another position Van Raalte had turned down. Albertus's life companion and helpmate, Christina, died of tuberculosis in 1871, leaving a hole in his heart he could not fill. And 3 months later, the million-dollar Holland fire destroyed the work of the pioneer generation. Van Raalte's verve in the face of disaster was said to be his finest hour, but the hard work had been done by the victims. The same year, the polemicists refought the 1857 church schism and dragged his name through the mud. His stupendous funeral and florid memorial resolutions on November 1876 should have cemented his reputation. These events were the talk of the town for a generation. The accolades were genuine, enthusiastic, and uniformly laudatory. But Van Raalte's day had passed. He was an old man resting on his laurels and no longer needed. The indispensable man was dispensable. It would take a century, the 150th anniversary of Holland's founding, before he was made a founding father and an icon with a 9-foot statue in his American hometown. So, lovely, lovely article. The magazine also contains letters from the Kansas frontier by Van Raalte, where he would write his son, and he was concerned about his son because his son hadn't married and his son hadn't formally joined the church. And there's just a number of very interesting letters to his son. Again, this primary material just gives you a sense of the time and a window into, obviously what very interesting life, but into the inner workings of his heart. There's this one section that I read that I quoted a little bit on Twitter, which I found so moving. He's talking about British politics. I read that Disraeli, former Premier of England, now Gladstone's opponent. Now I'm getting familiar with all of these men in English political history via my love for The Rest is History in that podcast. I read that Disraeli, former Premier of England, now Gladstone's opponent and perhaps England's new Premier, in describing man's life said, "Youth is a blunder, manhood a wrestling, old age a disappointment." What a different position from sort of the optimistic views of life that we have today. What does this statement, this is from his letter, this is what he wrote his son. This is long, beautiful letters to his son. Why does this statement contain so much truth? His perspective was, why is this so pessimistic? That's what it would be today. Why does this statement contain so much truth? Because our spiritual nature was not intended to be a slave of visible and tangible things, but to be a ruler over them as God's viceroy and image bearer. As long as man did not wrench himself from God, his source, the whole creation lay at his feet to devote it to the glory of his God. This is very Dutch Calvinist. Losing sight of his origin and life's purpose and of his Creator's claims upon him, man acquired a different purpose in life. Man enthroned himself instead of God and thus devoted the realm of his universe to himself. That is why youth is a blunder. If man does not know and choose God, he ignorantly loses himself in the glittering glamour of the world. Things change if, in youth, one becomes alerted to the pleasures of God. If one is alert to the truth, he will in his manhood expect to eat his daily bread in the sweat of his brow and not expect anything else. He will, moreover, justify this condition because of the fact of sin. This acknowledgement is made more easily in the measure that one, like Moses, can esteem the crown of Egypt far inferior to the fellowship with God's people, or, like David, can choose to be a doorkeeper in God's house rather than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. Surely old age is a disappointment if one has clung to this world as his highest good. Life is short. All flesh is as grass, and all the glory of the flower of the field. But if one seeks God for the highest good of his heart, he has not lived in vain, but has found the pearl of great price, namely peace with and capacity for God. Man does not lose this at death. Hence youth, manhood, and old age, all our sin, our sinful nature, and all the bitter fruits of sin notwithstanding, can be full of joy, salvation, gratitude, and hope if we turn back to God in the way he has opened for us. In that way one became a king and is filled with the hope of complete deliverance from sin. One shares in and inherits the glory and joys of heaven. Do not regard this point of view as strange for a letter conveying a birthday wish. He was writing a birthday letter to his son. I wanted to say to you, Dirk, do not halt between two opinions. I trust you would seek the Lord in secret, but also open your heart more tenderly to the tenderizing influences of God's Spirit and truth. I beseech you, set aside time for prayerful study of the Bible. Esteem the preaching of Reverend R. Peters highly and follow it. I desire to see that you will support the truth, God's ordinances, God's people, and God's congregation. That alone exalts and saves you. And as your temporal welfare, my child, serve and please God in your daily work and activities. Do not imagine that you control things. You will have noticed that although God usually prospers the best means and blesses one's activity, he nevertheless repeatedly shows the man who trusts in himself or in the means and the talents that all his success depends on God's blessings in the final analysis. Acknowledge your dependence on him and on his sovereignty. Submit yourself and give God the glory. Do not strive with your Creator. Now, his son will eventually marry, and his son will eventually join the church, just as a middle-aged man a little bit later than old Domini Van Raalte would have wanted. So, again, I just wanted to make a little video on this Origins magazine, a little bit more Christian Reformed history, and yeah, I hope you, if you're interested in this, again, you can find it online. I'll put a link in the notes so that you can check it out. Most of you probably won't be that interested in it because it's a lot of Christian Reformed history, but I find it always so pleasant to read these primary sources because you get a sense, you can read about Van Raalte, what an incredible man that he was, but then letters to his son, you can see his heart, see what he really cared about, and see what motivated him in the rather amazing life that he lived. So, yeah, leave a comment. Let me know what you think.